All right, let's get started. Let's do a call for opens and see who has anything they want to talk about tonight.
Yeah, hi Sean. You asked me to join for discussion of the page table lib test.
Yep. Okay, thanks. We'll get to that one. Any other opens?
Maybe the stability issues at the end of last week, if we have any other follow-up actions.
So, yep. So CI stability, OVMF, and what was the other root cause of problems?
Page table.
Oh, the page table long running test. Yeah. Thanks. Other topics? Rebecca and Mike, I know you guys have done a lot of talking this week on the mailing list over adding a lot of tool chains to CI and parallelism and other things. Is there anything there you want to bring up?
I don't think so. I will probably mess around with GitHub Actions on my own fork and see if we can figure things out and see how much parallelism we can actually get out of it.
Okay, I do have a GitHub action that builds EDK2 platforms, and I would and does it like Core CI does. So I think that you could basically copy that recipe pretty much if you wanted a starting point.
Yeah, I'm thinking of mostly running the Stuart CI build, splitting that up, starting off with EDK2, basically copying all the Azure actions, moving it into GitHub Actions, and yeah, seeing how quickly we can run them in parallel.
Yeah, so that's what I was saying is I have one of those that have already done that work. It's again, there's not a lot to it. You're completely right that you just kind of port over the Azure pipeline stuff. But if you'd like to see a sample of that, I'm happy to share that in.
Oh, that would be good. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll find it and put it in the chat here in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks. Oh, Michael Kabaki, I was wondering, you have a patch set you sent that includes a fix to patchcheck.py. I was wondering how close you are to being ready to commit that.
I believe I may have done that this morning, if it's the one I'm thinking of. Can you check the recent commits and see if it's one of those? If not, I can go.
Yeah, I checked it this afternoon and I didn't see it.
Okay, let me see. I thought it was if you look at the current EDK2 master branch, the second commit today, I think is the one that I believe you're referring to. It's 469.3b32 on the.
Oh yes. Yeah, that might actually be the one.
Okay. Yeah, I added you as a co-author on it, so you'll see both of our pictures there.
Right. Yep. Thanks.
Okay.
And Sean, one other topic is I've got Chris Johnson, who joined us today. He's the one that worked on the Google Mocks support. And so if anybody has any questions, he's available today in this meeting.
Okay, great. Anything else from anyone? Okay. I guess, Ray, since you're here, thanks for joining. And I think two of the topics kind of touch on this, right? So I think the two questions that came out is one, when we talk about host-based testing and testing that's going to run for CI, do we need to publish or document kind of runtime requirements around the performance of those tests? I mean, I think as we all saw last week, they can cripple our CI system and create huge queues. We ended up having to go in and cancel most everybody's build to try to get the queues down so that we could prioritize a fix to turn off those tests. Any thoughts there, Mike or others?
I just wanted to at least summarize that I think there's different categories of testing that are involved here. They can all run as a host-based test, but I think we need to distinguish host-based unit tests from kind of random test vector Monte Carlo-like tests versus fuzz tests. And I think those second two categories is probably things that we don't want part of our standard CI checks because they can have variable execution times. I think they're extremely valuable for local developer testing and maybe release test kind of time frames. I don't know if anybody else has other opinions on those three categories.
Yeah, Mike, I thought for a while for like how to divide the test into different categories. I think that for us, the page table test, you know, let's take another example. For example, we have an API called add, so it accept 2 integers and produce 1 output. For that add API, it'll be very easy to think about, okay, how many different kinds of input I can feed to this API to get a better coverage. So for that part, I think there's no need to randomize the input and feed into it. But for the page table lib, actually it accepts memory address, different attributes, the input, the kinds of input values are very different, and there are lots of kinds of inputs there. So I think in theory we can also avoid using like randomized input. We can create all of those test cases manually, carefully build the input to make sure that we have a better coverage. But um, I think our way is to pre-create some random number and pre-generate some input. But those input actually, they are fixed, determinist every time we run the test. And those random numbers will be fed to the API, page table API. This is to catch the potential issues in the page table lib implementation, because we know that the page table is a bit complicated structure. We don't want to make the API broke the existing page table structure. So I don't think it's like a fuzzy. It's still a unit test. And actually, yesterday, Joe and I, we managed to optimize the test case to make sure that it can run, and we tried, it can run in the CI server for like 2.5 minutes. And yeah, we did some optimization. I agree with Sean's comments that at least we should put some time limit to the host-based test. Make sure it does not last like 4 hours.
I mean, Ray, one of the questions I have though is when you put these predetermined vectors in there, which I assume were randomized the first time at least, like you don't really have, you're not really catching like edge cases, or you're not really, targeting certain code execution flows to make sure they're covered. You're just hoping that with enough random inputs, you can get better test coverage. Is that accurate?
Not quietly. Actually, when we provide the randomized input, we were, for example, we will make sure that some ranges, they are overlapped. The attributes might be different from the previous ranges. Yeah, we have some we made some choice when choosing the random number, choosing the random input.
I mean, would it not be, well, from an outsider's point of view, trying to read your test and figure out what you're testing, it would be a lot easier to understand that or see that if you actually had a test that said, catch overlap, and then you input the the data necessary to create that overlap situation,
Yeah, we
right?
actually in that test implementation, we have two kinds of tests. One is we call the manual test. We add the test cases like one by one. We add maybe 6 to 7 or 8 test cases. Test some corner cases. We think that there might be some issue there, and then we have another kind of test. That's the team here called the random test, and we did found that even with the manual test, it passes, but there is still some issues that can be caught by the second random test.
Right. So I think the question you raised is not whether or not the test is valuable. I think both kinds of tests have great value. So I wouldn't say you do one or the other. I think it's when do we run the random test. I think if we have the fixed tests that cover all the corner cases and we have like good code coverage measurements and we've made sure that we've added test cases as in order to improve code coverage, but maybe as a recommendation for a kind of a pre-commit test, you ask developers to run the random test, locally as opposed to part of CI or part of our release process. So anything that's considered any kind of random testing, we never put into our CI system directly.
Yeah, but I thought that CI system is to help us to catch the issues in the implementation. So yeah, I can ask the developer to manually run that, but I cannot 100% guarantee that I can remember that always, or maybe the developer he runs that, but he runs that using some different. He modified a bit, and he said, "Okay, I run it, it pass." There may be, the pass criteria might not be so strict as if we put the test in the CI.
Okay. Well, the other thing we can do, instead of doing it based upon the PR directly, there are ways to set up on-demand tests, which from like a GitHub perspective, it's there's a button to go click to say go run like some extended tests that you could either manually do or have on a cron job to maybe run once a week. So it can still be part of the tests available for running through our GitHub Actions or Azure pipelines as needed for EDK2 CI, but they're not part of the normal PR check. Sean, what do you think? What do you think about that, Sean? As far as having that other category of tests, that's really more of our things that we would run as part of our release process, but is available as on-demand things or a once-a-week run for a sanity check.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense.
The other thing you can have is file triggers. So I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes sense in this case, but
Yes.
you can use that as well. So if you think
But
there's a certain set of files that if they change, you should run certain tests, that's another way to trigger them.
yeah, but I think today's the trigger mechanism does not support such a small granularity.
So something I learned just a few days ago was about the GH workflow run command that does let you run workflows if it's set up to allow you to do so. So that could be something we could use.
So Rebecca, you mean basically have the workflow checked in, don't have it set up for automation, but then request that you can run it through the GitHub tool.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we should work on something like that. I mean, one other comment on the test is that I would think that I still am struggling to see how this isn't pretty much fuzz testing. But I think when you found one that triggered an error, I assume at that point you'd want your developers to analyze the inputs and outputs a little more closely, figure out what the true edge case is, and then write a manual test that mimics that, so that you are essentially using your fuzz tests or your random tests to find more edge cases that you may not have fully covered.
Yeah, I agree. That's approach to enlarge our manual test cases.
So I didn't look at this in a lot of detail, but what makes this test take so long? Is it the number of inputs and running it over and over again, or even a single
Okay.
run takes a long time?
Yeah. Okay. So actually, no. Imagine that the test case actually want to provide an array and a list of ranges, the memory ranges, and for different range, it asks for different page table attributes. For example, not present, writable, read only, not executable, any other attribute. So it will provide this range, the list of the ranges, and feed to the page table map API. Then it will make sure that the map can correctly change the paging table structure to meet the expectation. And we found that it takes too long because when we provide the input, we when we provide the input, the range that overlapped, and if the ranges if for example we have 10 ranges and the 10 ranges mostly overlap together, and the overlap range is very big, very long, then it will cause lots of time because it just break the entire memory space into lots of sub ranges, and also those sub ranges, they are how to say, they are quite big, because if you have big ranges, you need more paging structure to describe that. So with
Okay.
that, it takes too long. And then if we limit the ranges, actually, Zhiguang, he optimized the test case, and I also pasted the link in the chat window. So in this change, we limited the range upper limit from 10 gigabyte to 2 gigabytes. Then the time is reduced a lot, maybe just 1/10 of the old execution time. And also we try to, for example, to do some minor optimization to also reduce 50% of the execution time. And after all, now we have less than 3 minutes. Yeah, but Michael, I do like your idea about file level triggering, but I'm not sure. Yeah, based on my study earlier, it's not available today, right? Today is the package level.
We can do it. We would have to just set up a special flow using GitHub workflows. We can also combine different types. So like the GitHub workflow trigger that Rebecca mentioned, you can make your workflow support both that and file trigger if you want. That gives you the ability to manually run it anytime you want to, and then it will also run whenever a certain set of files are touched. So we have using the GitHub workflow triggers, we have quite a bit of granularity we can go to if we'd like to separate some tests off and put them on their own special workflows.
Yeah, for this page table lib test, actually it does not depend on the external component. The only component it depends on maybe is the memory copy. It does not depend on any memory location. It just modify the memory.
Okay, whenever
So,
you said you went from like 10 gigabytes to 2 gigabytes, did you lose anything in test coverage, or was that purely
yeah,
like
lose a
execution
bit,
time?
I think. Yeah, lose a bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, Ray, I think the reason why that test case exists is because the largest page tables are 1 gig page tables, correct? So then you
Yeah.
have to do coverage of, there's a single 1 gig page table, or there's an overlap across 2 1 gig page tables. So that gets you up to 2 gig, and then that's probably good enough coverage, but there's probably some other odd combinations on the loops you have to go through. If there's more than 2 1 gig page tables, you have to split up.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess like in summary, if we think it's appropriate and we wanted to, we could separate off these tests into their own GitHub workflow. That also has somewhat of an added advantage in the fact that we can parallelize tests between DevOps or Azure pipelines and GitHub agents. And so it allows us to exploit both pools of agents at the same time because we have a given number of resources on Azure pipelines and we have a whole separate pool of resources on GitHub. So if we run our normal CI on Azure pipelines and we run additional tests on GitHub workflows, it technically does allow us to achieve a bit more parallelization between the two of them. So that's another kind of just small advantage to moving some tests out if we like to
Okay.
there.
Yeah, Michael, we can explore that. So, but I have a question. So now we have like two test pool, two test resource pool. So what's the rule of like what kind of test should be in this pool, not that pool?
That's for us to decide. Today, the way it's separated is we have CI test on the pipelines. That means building the packages and passing in the various build types to those, like no opt, which runs the unit test. We do no target, which runs a lot of the CI plugins, and then we do the debug and release types. So we pass those types into the Stewart CI commands on the pipelines. The things that we do on GitHub agents is code QL, basically at the moment. And those are split off per package on each GitHub agent. So we could add, another GitHub workflow with its own trigger, and we could use another GitHub agent to run that workflow if we wanted to there. And another thing you can do is make these all kind of bubble up at the GitHub level to what's called status checks. So whenever you see things in a PR that have a pass or fail result, that's called a status check from GitHub's perspective. You can make certain status checks optional or mandatory. So that's another thing to keep in mind. That's like another level that you can go to. So you can have you can have GitHub workflows, and you could make those optional, for example. So you're getting the information back about how things went, but you're not necessarily enforcing that it must pass for the PR to complete.
Okay, wait a second. So you're
That's
saying the workflow cannot be a CI block checker?
it can be either. You can make it block
Okay.
or not block. I'm just saying that there's flexibility there depending on what we want to use it for.
Yeah, the additional challenge I see in this idea of having different categories of tests is that we have a pattern now where we fill out our package ci.yaml files with the, for example, the host-based DSC file, and then it discovers the tests to run. So now with this new category, we want to make sure that the default host-based runner does not pick those up, and that this different runner picks up these other tests, right? So we have to figure out how we distinguish these categories so we don't run them on both sides.
Yes.
Yep. So in the short term, can we essentially go back and maybe clean up that test a little bit so that it doesn't contain, like, well, I guess the question is, are the first manual test cases still useful to have in the test application and run on every PR?
Yes, that's definitely valuable. The question about the second one.
Yeah. So I don't, if it was easy enough to split out, then you'd create a second app and then we would somehow target that application for this new pool of testing.
Okay, use your You're saying using something like workflow?
Yeah, and I mean, in the short term, we can target it, directly. If we get more than about 3 or 4 of these, we may want to rethink that. But in the short term, I don't think there's anything wrong with the direct target.
You're saying that if the random test just spend a few minutes, it's okay to have them enabled as well?
No, I'm saying for the random test, if that was a separate test application, and let's say that we all agreed that 20 minutes was acceptable, or maybe it's 10, I don't know, somewhere in there, right? We can directly write a workflow that will target your test.
Okay.
And then if we have a couple more of these long running, somewhat important, maybe they're release style tests or weekly style tests, we can add those to the list and target them with this workflow as well. And if we get above 3 or 4, we may want to revisit this choice.
Okay, sure. So I think we can maybe just create one test app, but this test app will support will accept additional parameter. So with a different parameter, it's either run manual or the randomized test. And then the randomized test can be included in the workflow. Is that okay?
Yeah, seems fine by me. Other thoughts?
Sounds fine. If you need help with the workflow, let me know.
Oh yeah, sure, definitely. I can talk to you offline.
Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Any more things on that topic? I guess, do we agree in general that we're hoping that our host-based testing, I think we're talking about seconds of execution time. I'd hope that in general we're not even talking about minutes per test application. Is that a agreeable stance?
Yes, I agree with it should be in the order of seconds.
Yeah, as I think that we need to consider the case of a local developer running it as well. Like, it's one thing to say that you kick things off the CI and forget about it. But local developers also should be running and can run CI test. And in that case, it seems like you want to have the ability to be able to run these tests quickly as part of your development cycle and not have it consume a ton of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the
Yeah,
other thing
by
to
the way,
consider is if we are ever successful in scaling the number of unit tests that we have, host-based unit tests to, for example, all the components, that would be hundreds of components, and hundreds of components by times a few seconds adds up pretty quickly. So we have to be cognizant of if we, as this scales up, as we hope it will someday, that we'll actually then run into that like 10-minute, 20-minute, boundary with just running host-based unit tests.
yeah,
Yep.
my by the way, I remember that for OVMF boot we have a parameter called timeout. I remember, Mike, you submitted a patch to increase the timeout to 1 minute to 2 minutes. But for the host-based test, do we have a timeout value?
The host-based tests are part of the whole CI system. So I think they get lumped in with basically the build and test step, which is already a long running and pretty variable length thing. So it's kind of hard to put a accurate timeout on it because it's not per test. As it's authored today, it's not per test. So I think there's no timeout on it today, and it's probably tied to the default value.
Okay.
Which is like 6 hours or something like that, right, Sean?
We definitely have seen it go over an hour. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
So do you think
we
that
could add a
is
timeout
valuable?
if you want to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we had it at 60 minutes at one point in time, and then we had some changes that had a couple jobs of that was giving, artificial failures. and then we increased it. But I think we have a responsibility as a whole to keep our individual job runs down to a reasonable period of time.
So right now it's 2 hours, it looks like, is our timeout. And like Sean said, we basically build unit test as a different target type to the same command that we use to do debug and release builds. So we don't differentiate between compiling code and compiling tests and running them at the moment. So everything just has that 2-hour timeout applied to it.
I mean, we launched the executables. We could also put a timeout there probably as part of the test framework, and then not allow, running longer than 30 seconds or 20 seconds or something per executable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should. And the advantage of that is it would happen locally as well.
Yep.
So then that way, if you trip the timeout, you would know about it right before you get to CI on the server.
Yeah. So I think I think we'll learn a bunch of these things as we scale out more. I think we can take that as feedback and see if we can do something easy there. And then we'll just continue to adapt as we get more tests and different styles of tests. All right. Mike, did you want to go over anything around last week's CI crunch and anything additional?
Well, I think some of the details are on the mailing list. If you if you're curious and want to look at the details, some of them were pretty complicated. But I think we're back to a good state. And that's why I just wanted to do kind of a sound check through this group. Is anybody aware of any continued issues with are there any follow-up actions from the events of the end of last week?
Was there a root cause identified for the OVMF multi-proc hang?
Not a complete root cause. We've got what I consider a workaround now. They introduced an optimization to QEMU called multi-threaded TCG, and that's when the interaction with MP and SMM broke us. It was not an EDK2 code bug. It was a new QEMU feature, and if you force OVMF for that one feature back into its single-threaded mode, and that's single-threaded inside the implementation of QEMU, not about the number of threads in the emulated environment. If you put it back into its single-threaded mode, it works just fine. I've reached out to the QEMU developer that's worked on that feature to see if they have any advice on how to move forward, because I have a feeling this is deep within the optimization techniques of QEMU itself, and some probably world state that needs to be reset when you go in and do an SMI entry or an SMI exit across multiple virtualized processors. So I don't think there's going to be a quick or easy answer to that one to enable that full optimization technique that's available in QEMU.
Okay, interesting.
I'm about to post a link in the chat of something weird we can talk about. Not that I think we want to do anything about it. So this series of jobs pretty much seems to be never ending. So I guess what I've noticed is at least at one point in time last week, there were a number of CI runs that the jobs never really reported their status back accurately for. As you can see, these here have been, they say they've been running for 5 days and 9 hours. I don't know if this is something we want to look at further. Since last week, everything I've seen over the weekend and so far has reported accurately. It seems like there may have just been a moment in time whenever like Azure Pipelines was not reporting status back correctly. But if you look back through the commit history in EDK2, you might see that some of the commits still have pending jobs like this one. And I don't know when they're ever going to stop or if they will. We could always cancel these and then rerun them, and they'll probably just work and give us a green check mark if we cared to get to closure on them.
I mean, the builds that back them are not running, and they all completed within reasonable time.
And one of them is a CodeQL run that hasn't completed either. But it says that it did complete, but it's still showing the yellow spinning status, even though the job complete is done.
Yeah, which kind of leads me to believe that there's some issue with like status reporting or something on GitHub that happened around this time, because
Right.
it's on both the pipeline side and on the GitHub workflow side.
Yeah. Did you try rerunning all the jobs just to refresh that one to see if it would go to a completion status?
No, I think at the time I was not able to due to my permissions. I'm not sure if I can now.
Oh, and it actually said it. Mergify pushed the change through too.
Yeah, I'm not. This is just one of the weird things that happened
Yep.
last week.
Yep. So it looks like I agree with you. It looks like it's stale status information here.
I think the only real harm is like if we look back through the EDK2 commit history, we're going to see these pending statuses, and it's a bit weird because you don't really know if those worked or not. So maybe we could just cancel them and then rerun them, and that should pop the fresh status back through.
Yeah. Okay, good thing to monitor. I think more active monitoring of the PRs by our admins will be helpful too, to see if when things are going south.
The other thing I noticed is there was also a period of time where a lot of submodules were failing to clone. But again, I don't know if that's something we necessarily have a fix for. It just seems like whenever we issue a large number of jobs at once, it tends to increase the likelihood of maybe like the GitHub server or whatever getting overloaded and then failing to give
Okay.
back a few of the repo clones.
Right. Like I saw like Google, even a Google test repo
Yes.
clone failed in one I was looking at earlier today. So yeah, I think we should monitor that. And I provided links to the retry action that's available in GitHub Marketplace, that if we have common failure points, maybe we can spot weld with some retries.
Yeah, I think that's probably the approach we'll have to take for now. If there was some like repo caching mechanism that we could do to avoid having to reach out so much, that would probably be helpful to add at some point.
Yep.
All right, sounds good. Anything else on CI from last week?
Pip module caching's in and appears to be working okay. So if anyone's interested in seeing what's cached on GitHub workflows, just in case you don't know, you can go to the Actions tab, and then on the lower left side, there's a button that says Caches. That button will show you all of the things that are cached on the EDK2, kind of like GitHub workflow cache. And right now, you'll see that we have 3 pip caches there. So every single time a pip module changes, like we update to a new version or something like that, the very first job that runs populates the cache. And then in the future, every single job that's set up against the same set of pip configuration, so it's using the same modules with the same versions, it will pull from the cache. So if you look at, I think Rebecca made a change to update EDK2 base tools, and I think that triggered this most recent cache here because the EDK2 base tools module updated. So because that module got rolled to a new version, it generated a new pip module cache in the PR. So that's what the ref is for that cache entry. So that means if we complete that PR, all of the future CI runs will use that pip module cache instead of the previous ones. And these last for 7 days. So if we don't use any CI runs or run any PR gates that use old pip module caches, they'll automatically disappear after 70 days. There's a 10 gigabyte limit on caches per repo and an unlimited number of entries. So if we did want to cache additional things, like one thing I've cached on the Project News site is the code QL CLI. It's about 250 megabytes. We could cache additional things here as well, up to 10 gigs. It's just an FYI for you should see pip modules almost always come from cache now. They shouldn't be reaching out across the internet except in the initial run that goes and grabs them to populate the cache.
Do you know how much faster it is?
Not really. I was actually mainly doing this for reliability than performance, but I didn't check the performance yet.
Okay.
I've seen some significant improvements, Sean. It depends on what scope you cache at. I did some experiments where, like, even installing an updated version of Python and the pip requirements, and then I cached the entire Python install with all the pip modules installed, and that went from like a 1 minute kind of operation down to just a couple seconds. So there's some huge advantages possible here if we use it smartly.
Okay, interesting.
The other thing I'll mention, speaking of Python versions, is we do have to go download Python every time, because one of the issues we run into is that we're using the Windows 2019 image, and that has Python, I believe, 3.7 installed by default. And because we're trying to use 3.10 or whatever we're set to right now, that means we always have to go and download Python every single time. If we went with the Windows 2022 image, which doesn't have Visual Studio 2019, so we can't. But if we did, that would have Python 3.11 installed by default. So if we had some way to cache Python, I think that would also reduce our time quite a bit.
I think, Michael, we were talking about bringing VS 2022 to the toolchain, right?
Yeah, that'd be nice.
That might be the
that's what we're
long-term fix.
Yeah, that's what we're doing on our side. we just use the Windows 2022 image with VS 2022.
Can we not push a custom image like we do for the Linux images?
We could, but I'm not sure how that works with the Azure hosted agents.
Okay.
I don't, maybe Sean knows, but I think for the Azure hosted agents, we have to use an Azure image.
So we've talked about using a Docker container for Windows as well. The problem with Docker on Windows is that it's very large. And so we have played around with that. I mean, it would be really nice to provide our own environment and get back to a uniform way of managing these dependencies and doing it all through containers. But the performance of that and doing that, 12,000 times a day actually was quite painful. So I don't know if there is caching done on the container level. We probably blow up to 10 gigs with the one Windows container, but that's what we're kind of watching right now, and that's why we haven't done it.
Yeah. Okay. So think about git clone and performance and stuff. Are we doing a full git clone each time, or do we limit the amount of history we fetch, or could we even do a git archive instead?
We have played around with having a fetch depth of 1. Something broke with that. I don't know, Mike, if you remember that, but something broke back a couple years ago when we first turned that on because we didn't have the ref to compare to.
Right, because when you submit a PR, it's not always against master. It could be off of a SHA that could be back in history a few weeks or even a few months, depending upon when the last time the PR was updated. And so in order to identify the change history, we have to have that join point between the PR and the master branch in the history for us to be able to find it.
Ah, okay.
We could talk about a depth of 50 or doing something like that, which I think we tried, or we may have done even for a little while, but all of that's just, you know, some options to save a little bit of time. I don't think it actually saved us all that much anyways. But I mean, yeah, I think every 6 months or a year, it's probably worth reevaluating some of the, you know, and relooking at the performance of the build. I think I noticed that we've added a whole ton more OVMF builds and ARM vert builds. So there's a lot more parallelism going on every PR that impacts those packages at least. So I think, you know, it's probably wise to keep analyzing where we're spending our time and if we can optimize that more. Which I think, Mike, you just sent a change to do some of that.
Just a
for-
rebalance. Yeah, a rebalance of some of our execution times as a proposal. We'll see if it makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Are we on to the Google Mocks stuff? And I know, Michael, you had said on a note that you hadn't had time. I also haven't dug in as deeply as I'd like. Is there any open questions for today? Are we at a point where we just want to get this series in so that people can start using it, or what's the thoughts?
Yes, we would like to get it in as soon as possible. If there's general questions even today, I think Chris is here and can help answer those. I did a pretty poor job, I think, last week. So if you have general questions, he can do a much better one.
I guess we could maybe start with, since Chris has played around with this more than anyone else. Is there any major like shortcomings or gotchas that you found in working with this that you think we should be aware of, or any areas that you think might be particularly difficult for people to like learn how to use it and things like that?
Yeah, so I think probably the first thing that comes to mind is that when you're creating a mock, it can't have more than 15 arguments. And I know there are some functions in EDK2 that have a lot of arguments. I haven't done a check on exactly which ones have the most, but that is something to be aware of. That is just something Gmock doesn't support. And also variadic functions, so you can't mock those directly. Those are probably the two biggest things I think that would come up. Other than that, I think the only thing is probably the learning curve of just understanding how Gmock works, because it's got a bunch of macros that are very useful. And once you understand how they all work and what they do, you start to see how powerful it is and how elegant it is. But it does take a little bit of just time to understand, hey, what is this expect call macro doing, and where do you put in your checks for these arguments, and what do all these terms mean? But it's really well documented, and so it's not hard to get there. There just is. You can't just step in day one and think, oh, I'm going to get this all done my first test real quick. It takes a little bit of time to understand, but once you do, everything is consistent and nice to follow. That's probably the quick summary of the things that I'd say are negative about it.
And have you compared it to like the unit test framework and CMACA? Like, does it have better capabilities, or is it just a little bit nicer programming interface?
Than you mean the current framework that's in EDK2?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, the one thing that's really nice about it is just how quick it is to add a test. Like you can just you create a file and you make a test macro and put an assert in there, and like have a simple main function. It just works, and you add another test. You don't have to worry about adding a new test suite or any of that stuff, right? Like with the other framework, you've got to go create like the function that actually builds up the test suites and then adds the test cases and all that stuff. Like all that is just handled nicely within the Google test framework in general. There's nothing new that Mocking brings to it, and Google test is already in there. But there are some of the examples that were added for Google test were done in an area that already had the framework test examples, so you can see kind of how much less code it is to get tests done. And the mocking, I believe, is easier. The syntax may be if you're coming from a straight C background, the syntax is a little bit, again, of a hurdle to get over. But once you do that, you understand it. It's a lot easier and a lot less code to get the mocks to work, and you don't have to write the mocks. Like, you literally just say, all right, I'm going to declare it. Here's my arguments, and then you put your definition with the macro, and you can then just use it, right? You don't have to worry about, allocating things in a certain order and all that stuff. It's all just handled for you underneath the covers of Gmock, which is really nice.
And Sean, I'd say one of the other advantages is like just Google Test in general. It has like that plugin for Visual Studio Code called C++ TestMate that lets you see individual test suites and test cases, and you can browse right to the test case or run an individual test case or debug an individual test case. So it's from a developer efficiency, once you're into the style of writing tests and you're just wanting to go write a bunch of them or add a few, that's a big productivity enhancement, I think, if you like Visual Studio Code.
Yeah,
completely agree. Yeah, it's just literally you just right click, debug, and off it goes in the test you want. It's really nice. And then the errors are actually in line too. If you're using Visual Studio Code, it'll show you, take you to the assertion that failed and show you the errors that are there for that assertion. And the development environment's really nice.
Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite things about it. And it's very consistent with the way that like a lot of other debuggers work or languages work in Visual Studio Code, like Python unit test. It has like a very similar experience there, which is nice for like the C code that we write. I think the other thing that go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So Mike, you just mentioned the VS Code plugin. What's the name?
I think it's C++ TestMate.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
That's it. And that's in the README too.
The thing I noticed through the README was, I wasn't sure if this was clarified somewhere or not, but it was differentiating, I think, between like design functions and mock functions. And I don't know if like design functions was defined anywhere, was it? Or I may have missed it, but it was like a little not
the terminology
confused.
was unclear.
The terminology was
Yeah.
just like I spent a little bit thinking, okay, what's a design function? And then I at some point I caught on that it was differentiating between mock and functions and normal code by those terms.
Yep. Do you have a recommendation for another term? Because I agree that we're trying to get the point across. And yeah, it was like production function was something else, but then that didn't line up.
No, I don't have a great recommendation. I'll just say that that was just something that like in my read through took a little bit to connect the dots on, but
okay.
I don't think it's a big problem. I'm just mentioning it.
Okay. Yeah, it's something to think about. Yeah, I just looked. It's in there like 7 times, and we can think through if there's a better terminology to use.
Okay. Yeah, I just mentioned that.
It's a good comment.
I think other than that, since I'm one of the maintainers of the unit test framework package, I can go through and I think we could probably get this in without like iterating a whole lot on this thing, because from what I've seen, it looks like you've already done quite a bit of probably internal iteration or preparation for this. So I think it's close enough to where it needs to be that I don't probably need to spend as much time like necessarily using every feature that it provides and all that I could probably just look at it a bit more and give some reviewed buys, and then if we have anything else we want to improve upon it, we can just do that and commits on top.
Sounds good. And something to look at is there's the mock function macros, and then there's the mock function internal macros. Just I'll let you read through and understand and see before I give away give you a clear mind about it. But that's something, just make sure that makes sense and is clear, because that's a very important distinction between the two and when to use them and how to use them.
Okay, and I saw that there were a number of things, and it looked like in maybe the README that you're going to update. are you planning to send out another patch series with that update, or are you waiting for like additional feedback before you send out that next patch series version?
Mike, that one's for you because Mike's the one managing the patches for me.
Oh, as far as the comment that we have a couple minor updates queued up
Yeah,
already.
I think there was
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
five items or something. It looked like at one point that got sent out.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll get that in probably tonight or tomorrow, Michael. But I think they're all very minor, right, Chris?
Yeah, they're all minor, and they're done. And we can potentially figure out if there's a different name for design function we want to use and roll that in there too.
Yeah, we were just waiting like just the 1 week to get some review feedback, Michael, before we sent out a V2. Because so far the only thing that we have updates for are our comment changes, README changes only.
Okay, I do think that the other thing that Sean mentioned about documentation would be helpful.
The
'Cause-
test cases themselves, having a summary of the test case, like we've got that queued up as well.
Yep, that's
Okay.
in there too.
all right, yeah. Do you know, I may have missed this, does this work with all the unit test coverage stuff that's there today?
I think I looked at it on the PR where the open CPP coverage information and GCov LCov information I think is correct. Yes.
Okay.
I think it should. I think all that's in the end, that will just be those executables. And since this just generates executables as well, should be fine.
Okay. Then I'll look at this and try to get the reviews out like by end of day tomorrow. And then Mike, if you send that V2, it won't make a big difference, but I'll just give the reviews on top of that if I see it by then.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks. All right. Anybody have any last items? All right. Talk next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.